I wonder whether it was right to schedule this at lunchtime, given that we're talking about food. It's a real pleasure to be here, to be in conversation with Samin Rushdie. We've only just met. Mm-hmm. I know the book. Let's talk about the reason that you wrote it. I mean, it was first published in this country in 1988, so 30 years ago. What was your feeling about the way in which Indian food was presented 30 years ago and what people's views were about it?
I came to this country to live. Well, I didn't come to live, but I've been here since 1980, and I never ate out food that I could recognize as the food that we ate at home. And that's partly because Indian restaurants in England, right from the 60s, were really quite appalling. And so it was to...
Define appalling. What was terrible about them?
They had, when I first came here in the 60s, they had, I don't know, hundreds, 100. It was like the jokes people used to make about Chinese food. They had 120 dishes, all of which tasted the same.
Did they all look the same too?
They all sort of looked the same, and they were all so hot that you couldn't really taste the flavour anyway, so it didn't matter. They always made you ill when you left. And so as Indians, Pakistanis, you never ate out that food because it really wasn't very good. They were very much curry houses, as they were called, pejoratively, but they deserved it. A lot of them were run by Siletis, who are recent immigrants to this country. Full marks to them for their business acumen, but they were young boys, men who had come from the rural villages and became our restaurateurs and they knew that what sells is Mughlai. So instead of perhaps selling food that they recognized from their Bengali tradition, they were presenting this as high Mughal food. So anyone who's from North India was really quite ashamed of this, and English people were eating it quite happily. And so it was partly that, partly to think things were different, things are a little different now, but at that time, definitely, it was something to be ashamed of what was being served out.
And the use of the word curry as a sort of generic term, what was that all about? Where do you think that
I have a real bugbear about this word. It's funny how when things get used a lot in England, we start using them ourselves. And I've heard a lot of Indians and Pakistanis now say the word curry, but I find it racist. I find it this reductionist of our entire cuisines, plural, into this one word, whether it's meat, whether it's fish, shellfish, vegetables, it doesn't matter. It's all a curry, as long as it swims in a nondescript gravy. It's a curry, and that's the food that we are accused of eating. And actually, it's one of the highly nuanced cuisines, highly evolved, and it's a way of, it puts it down, it keeps the restaurant prices down, and it is a basic racism that makes that happen. Because then, when my children go to school with their lunch boxes, they don't want to take a kebab and a paratha because there's a smell that people don't like, or they'd rather take a cheese sandwich because then no one talks about it. So that was the generation in which I wrote the book.
I remember that so clearly myself when I went to school. I never had school lunches. My mother would always make me food, and it would very often be a sandwich, but with whatever we'd eaten the night before.
Exactly.
And I remember so clearly opening my Tupperware and people... It's interesting that you use the word racism when you talk about the word curry, but I remember so clearly people saying, "Oh, that food's disgusting, let's get away from the Mackie." And that over food, I think, is really, it's so deeply wounding. I mean, apart from the fact that it is racist and deeply offensive, but it's wounding because so much of my experience of food was to do with the conviviality that it created in the home, and so to have that reaction felt really, really hurtful. I want to take you back to your childhood and your memories of eating and your mother as a cook.
So my childhood was in Bombay. That's where I grew up, and Bombay is a very unusual place, even in India. It's not India. So all the culinary expertise at that time was certainly contained in the domestic sphere. People didn't eat out to eat Indian meals. Indians didn't eat out. And because it was so much more a plural society than Pakistan today is, or the Pakistan that I then went to live in, it meant that you were able to eat different kinds of food because you went to all kinds of different homes. Not everyone came from a similar background. So your friends were Jains, or your friends were Parsis, and your friends were from different kinds of, and Bombay was a melting pot of people, so it's not even like the rest of India. But our food at home was very much a North Indian food from a kind of Delhi. My father was from Delhi, Kashmiri background. That was the desi khana that we ate. We also ate Angrezi khana, which was a kind of precursor of what's now recognized as a genre in its own right, Anglo-Indian food, which really the cooks of that time improved upon the bland food they were being asked to cook by their sabs and their mem sabs, and they spiced it up a little and made it tastier. So what we ate as chops or cutlets or roast chicken isn't really what you, certainly at that time, in England the food was much blander and much more ordinary.
Slightly spicy macaroni cheese.
Yes, I mean garlic, nobody here ever used garlic, but yes, our macaroni cheese would have cayenne pepper in it, and it would be really quite tasty.
And what about the influence of your mother? Because it's very present, and you could argue that actually one of the reasons why you've wanted to write the book is to have that legacy of that kind of cooking just to be passed on to the next generation.
I didn't think about it then because I didn't have any children, but I think food does inform us of who we are and connects us to our past and to our roots. And with the globalization and so many of our children growing up here, it would be a shame if the only food they knew was what they ate out, because the best of our foods are contained within the home cooking. So it wasn't my motivation then. Then it was the only food I knew. So if I had an opportunity, I was made an offer to do this. So it was the only food that I could rely on feeling confident about. So it was personal to my experience having grown up in Bombay, the food we ate at home. I was married to a man who came from West Bengal, and then so there was Bengali food and how they handled fish, which was a little bit different to how we in Bombay had handled fish. So it was personal to my life. Which is a nice legacy now for them.
Of course, and your daughter's in the audience today, and I am so deeply grateful to the solidity of having a book, because anything that was handed to me by my mother, who's still alive and lives a 2-minute walk around the corner from where I live, she would say, I'd say, okay, so tell me how to make this. And she'd say, well, you just take a cup of this and a bit of that and a bit of that. And I'd be like, okay, whoa, hang on just a second. And your experience with your mother was exactly the same. Yes. Just describe the moment when you were actually put in charge of the family's meals for a week.
My mother I don't think she would describe herself as a feminist, but if we ever tried to be involved with food, she would say, you've got all your lives to cook, just leave it. So we didn't really go into the kitchen. And certainly at that time, in middle-class families, there would be a cook. So my experience first but all the food in our house, whoever cooked it tasted like my mother's food, and we would hear her describing to people how that needs to be, and she would look at it and say, no, this needs a little more of this and a little more of that. And I've tried to do some of that in the book, to say recipes are not just about weighing and measuring teaspoons and cups of things, but to understand what you're doing and why things should look like at different stages, because then you can kind of catch yourself if something's going wrong. And that was my experience with her, because suddenly my grandmother was very ill and she had to leave, and there was no one in the house to do the cooking. So she said, oh, you can do this.
How old were you?
I was old for someone who'd never cooked. I mean, I must have been 18. And she just said, like exactly as you described, you fry the onions till they're a nice pinkish almondy color. And she said, how much? Take 1 or 2. And she said, the more onions you use, the better it'll taste. And use lots of ghee because that makes it taste nice. If there's too much, remove some from the top afterwards. It doesn't matter, you know. And
were you terrified?
Yeah, I thought it would all go wrong. And even while I was cooking, I thought, that doesn't look right. And miraculously, at the end, ta-da, it was right. And it was right because you just have to trust that you follow every stage. And I was looking at what I was doing rather than spending my time with it, because no one had scales in the kitchen or things like that. Onions didn't come as uniform as they now do, so you kind of 2 onions could mean anything. But now everything is so uniform in the shops that you can...
I want to ask you about, I mean, this idea that must have given you so much confidence of your ability, and there is always this kind of notion that to be a good cook, one has to have some, I don't know, instinct for it, and that being able to cook can't be learned, and I'm not sure that that's true.
I think anyone can cook. I think that even my mother, when she didn't cook for a long time, her food would not be the best. It's just how much you do it. But anyone can cook as long as you think about what you're doing. And I really don't think they say you've got green fingers. In Urdu, people say "haathon mein lazzat hai," which means you have a kind of taste in your hand. And I think these myths were probably all generated by men that kept women in the kitchen because they said, "Oh, they're so good, you know, this is something women need to do," until it became a commercial venture. And then there were professional cooks and your restaurants, and suddenly that was all men.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
But you mentioned, I'm really interested in this idea of the reductionism that's caused by the semantics when we talk about food and the racism, because it's quite clear that there's very little about food that is just about food. You know, it is political, not least when you look at the fact that your family didn't go to Pakistan immediately after partition, and in many ways the way in which you ate, the amount of meat that you ate, put you in a minority in Bombay. I wonder how aware you were of that as a teenager.
We ate, although that mattered sometimes in school. When our school lunches, we used to have these long tables in the basements of our school, and sometimes then I was aware that there was a lot more meat on my plate than there was on someone else's plate. But like I said, Bombay was very different, so that was all right. That was sort of all right to be.
You've mentioned the way in which Bombay felt to you when you were growing up, and this notion of a kind of cosmopolitan city with lots of different sorts of people. I want to talk about the title of this book, the fact that you've chosen to call it Indian Cookery, because we know that food, we're so used to it now in the 21st century, food's crossing boundaries, bringing people together, the kind of fusion of different tastes and so on. I wonder how consciously you were thinking, I want to call this book Indian Cookery.
You know, last night I thought, let me read the introduction because I haven't read it for 30 years and you might ask me something. And I was so pleased to see that one of the things I wrote is that food doesn't divide into Indian, Pakistani or Bangladeshi, because the subcontinent can be almost, you can draw the map into culinary regions. Just as it has so many languages, we have different clothes, and we're not uncomfortable with that. We're fine with that. And so why, I have so often Pakistani friends will say to me, why, this is Pakistani food, and I'll come to that in a minute, because what has happened since the divisions of the country, but actually the food divides into the regions of the subcontinent more than national boundaries, I think. And we all call the food Indian food for the food we eat. And I'll call their food Hyderabadi food, or Goan food, or Parsi food. My food is Indian food. And I have no problem with that. They'll do the same. They'll call the food they eat, and they'll call my food North Indian food, and someone's food South Indian food. So actually the descriptions of the food are much more regional based. It can also be, there are dietary rules that come with religions. And what's happened in Pakistan when the society became much less plural is, I think, that the North Indian cuisine, just like the Urdu language was for a long time the official language, I think the North Indian cuisine became a kind of pan-Pakistani cuisine. I don't think the Baloch and the NWFP foods got the same look in. What's served at weddings and what's served when you want to do something special, it's usually based on North India. And the other thing that I noticed when my family moved to Pakistan, that people who would come over would be surprised at how many vegetable dishes there were on our table. And vegetables were not always cooked alongside meat, which I think in Pakistan happens a lot more. In my grandmother's home as well, there was aloo gosht and shaljam gosht and bhindi gosht, but everything was
with the meat.
With the meat.
Yeah.
And so I think that there are things that have evolved and have now become a kind of ban. But I don't know. I still don't think that you can call our food by its national boundaries so much as...
I wonder also about our relationship with the way in which the origins of the food. I mean, if you were growing up as you were in Bombay, where you had a cook in the house that made the meals according to your mother's instructions, everything would be fresh, and the meat, the chicken would be slaughtered, and you would have some connection to, the way in which we now are rediscovering real food, and the real food movement in Western developed countries is quite interesting, isn't it, when you look back on what you are familiar with?
Well, exactly, because the chickens came to the house in baskets in my generation, but even as late as when my children were young and we went to Bangladesh, and the man came selling hens, and they thought, oh, how lovely, and they were playing with the hens, and then later those hens were on their table. And they hadn't made that connection between the supermarket chicken, because they were children growing up here, and the hens they'd just been playing with that morning in the field.
And I, the other thing as well that's quite interesting is when I talk to English friends about mutton. I'm not a big meat eater, but I grew up in a family that was obsessive about eating meat. But this distinction between mutton and lamb, I mean, lamb is not eaten really that much, is it? And I find that quite interesting.
Yes, I don't know why. I mean, whether that's availability or... My mother used to say that lamb is a very fatty meat, and in a hot country, there was a smell to the meat. And it's interesting because when we used to go to Kashmir every year as children, there was always lamb in the mountains. And it wasn't the same smelly meat, and there wasn't that goat. So I don't know whether it's that, but certainly what we used to call mutton was goat's meat, which was, now everyone recognizes it to be a very healthy meat, and it's lean, it's a less fatty meat, so it's probably healthier for us.
I want to ask about the distinctions between Indian food in this country, which goes back to when the first Indians, in terms of the restaurants that you were mentioning, that completely destroyed and corrupted what Indian food is, and compare that to the way in which Indian food is perceived in the United States, because this book has just been published in the US, and in the US, Indian food was seen very much as a kind of, not central in any way at all. And one can understand because of the lack of Indians in the country for a very long time, and that's changing. But I wonder what sort of reception you've had with this book in the US.
It's done very well this time. I mean, it was a real pleasure. I mean, for me, all of this is happening without having had to do the work. The work was done 30 years ago, so suddenly there's an interest. But I think the world is different now. When I wrote that book, things were not available easily, and I was explaining to people where they could get things. There's a much greater willingness on people's part to cook food that's foreign. At that time, there was all those myths about how this food is overspiced and it's not healthy and it's difficult and overcomplicated to cook. And I was always telling people I can get home from a day's work and there are things that you can make very simply and feed a family. It doesn't have to be complicated. But I think the world is different. I think people, through the advent of all these ready meals, there's a lot of ready meals in all our big supermarkets now, so a lot more people have eaten it. I don't think...
bought one?
If I was clever, I would today be a rich woman. When the book first came out, if I had any business acumen, one of the things that they did for the book publication was around that time, all of this was very new, ready meals were very new, and Good Housekeeping got me to do a blind tasting of Marks and Spencer's and Sainsbury's and Tesco's and all of this. And what I ought to have said was, you know what, you could do with this, and I could advise you to do that, and I would today be in a different position. But instead what I said was, this is really awful. This is really inedible, and it's as bad as anything that we were ever eating. Anyway, it was just something.
It's so interesting.
Yes.
I mean, I would really urge anyone who's interested in food to buy this book. I mean, because I have to show it to you. The cover is absolutely beautiful, and there is not a single picture in it. It's not your classic glossy cookbook. And to me, that's to its credit, because actually the detail in it is the thing that makes the book really successful, and in many ways a kind of cult classic. What was the thinking behind that? Was that just in order for it, because it was going to be a cheap production? Was that the reason for the publishers not to have, you know, I mean, food photography is huge business now.
I'm not sure. It probably was, because I wasn't a known person. And I was just pleased to have the opportunity to do it. And I think actually it was part of a series at that time, and all of them were brought out similarly. But certainly for me doing it, people say, who did you write it for? And I was writing it in England, and really I wrote it not because I think a lot of the Indian cookery books wrote for a Western market that we're writing here, and I was just writing it for me, and I wanted it to be as accessible to Indian and Pakistani friends, and that they shouldn't feel that this is somehow adulterated in some way, or and I also wanted it to be useful to people who cook all the time, and they could think, okay, let me try this, and for people who are coming to it new. And the only way to do that is to just do it for you, to do what you think is clear, and have a very matter-of-fact approach to it.
This edition has an introduction by your brother Salman. Tell us the story of when you first wrote it, how he helped you to test the recipe.
Well, I guess that the only person here I knew who knew what the food should taste like was him. But the end result, and did it work for other people? Because for me, it was interesting, because I wrote the whole book without having done the column that has the weights and measures and how much. So I wrote the recipe, and I said what should be in it, and that sort of was coming right at the end, because I would think, okay, the next time I cook, I must pay attention. And so then, because he wasn't cooking a lot at the time, so I thought that, you know, use him. So yes, it was helpful. To give him a recipe and see if it works. So if it works for someone who knows what the food should taste like, but who's not really a very proficient cook.
And did he come back and say, no, I can't taste this sort of flavour, or, you know, did Mum put, you know, did she put mace in it, or that, is it missing? Was he that refined as a... No.
I don't think so. It was so long ago that I don't remember, but I do recall him doing some stuff around it.
Let's have some questions from the floor. I've got more things to ask you, but if people have got some questions, let's wait for a microphone.
I agree with you. The food in retail stores, Marks and Spencer, Sainsbury, and so on, is awful. Is there a possibility to improve it? Can it be can good Indian food be retailed in the way?
You know, it can. One of the things that you mean, can it be packaged as a ready meal?
Yes, and
I don't see why not.
Shelves and so on. Why have they not? Even after 20 years, why have they not?
Well, they haven't done me. But
there's clearly still a market for it. You could become the consultant.
Yes, but I don't see any reason why not. Our food freezes very well. Our food keeps in the fridge when it's made. Also, the spicing of it. You know, I talk about curry powders, and but it's also because some of what's sold, the garam masala that you can buy in the shops, is awful, and that's what ruins the food. It all looks black, and it all doesn't taste right. It's because the garam masala spices are quite expensive spices out of the whole genre of all the different spices, and the ilaichis and the kala zira and all those things. So I think they just use a lot of other brown powders, and they don't actually make it well. And I think it's probably a cost thing. And it's that whole thing about how Indian food needs to be inexpensive and cheap. People aren't willing to pay. It's interesting, even our chefs now, you know, the ones, that is changing, and there are some upmarket restaurants where people can get a good meal and a good evening out. But there's still that attitude that it needs to be not like a French restaurant.
And do you now go to those upmarket restaurants and think, yeah, this has really changed? And it's good food.
But not often, because we tend, if we eat out, and we eat so much Indian food at home, we'll eat other things if we eat out.
But there were a couple of other hands. There's a hand just there in the middle, and then we'll go to the back. Do you want to just wait for the microphone? It's quite a big room. Thank you.
So thank you for that. It's fascinating. Quick question. Why do we not have really authentic foods in the restaurants like we cook at home? What's the reason?
Why don't you? I think our culture was very much, the most culinary expertise was always home-based. You know how that's changing? The other day on television I heard a chef compliment a home cook, not Indian food, but other food, to say, oh, that's restaurant quality food. So suddenly, with French food, restaurant quality food is somehow the thing to aspire to. But the best, with Indian foods, the best cooking is found in people's homes. Now, why that doesn't translate into a commercial kitchen, I don't know. I don't see there's any reason why it shouldn't.
Gentleman just in the...
But it does translate in a couple of cases.
Yes, things are much better.
No, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that there's nothing like home-cooked food and so on. But there are a couple of very good restaurants right here in London which are extremely close, if not as good.
Definitely.
And so,
No quarrel with that, and I'm really pleased to see it. I'm also pleased to see how so much that things are very different from when I wrote the book. There's a lot of Indian chefs. Even in India, you know, where I said it was a very oral tradition. It was hand-me-down, mother to daughter. But now there's a younger generation are using cookery books. The world is too big a place. There are chefs that they follow on television, both also in India. And so they have a following there, and people are buying books, and so it's all different, and restaurants are improving, and chefs are improving, and it's getting the kind of status that it didn't have, the outside the home status.
So I think one of the things that this book does, sorry, go ahead, sir.
You know, I think, you know, to the point you were making earlier, you know, for me, you know, I come from a family who are migrant Pakistanis from India, and they live in Pakistan. As a matter of fact, I'm the only one here with my family. And you know, so for me, Desi cuisine is also, at least philosophically at one level, a preservation of a culture and preservation of your past, because your kids don't really get to eat it. But then there's the operating reality of living in a London flat, and it does smell peculiar to your neighbor. So there is this operating reality that we have to contend with. And it's not necessarily something bad or wrong for your neighbor who's from Edinburgh to find that smell distasteful. And we just need to be aware of that.
I think that's quite interesting, isn't it, in the context of what we are told is the national dish, chicken tikka masala. Yes, I mean, what you've just said in the context of that makes it quite an interesting political...
I recall Robin Cook held up chicken tikka masala as the finest example of British multiculturalism at the time when he was foreign minister, and he said what they did was they took an Indian dish, chicken tikka, and added a sauce to it so that the British, who liked a gravy with their meat, were satisfied. You'd have a while explaining that to some of us, for whom chicken tikka masala is certainly a British invention.
I mean, is it about confidence, though? This idea of acknowledging that people might find it difficult to absorb that this is, you know, the smell is slightly, you know, makes them feel slightly uncomfortable. I mean, I think that is changing, definitely. But is it about lack of confidence amongst amongst ourselves that we're not prepared to say, well, look, this is absolutely a manifestation of my culture?
No, I think I'm incredibly self-confident. I think the issue is about perhaps civic sense. It is, honestly,
You're so polite, that's fantastic.
Can I come back on that and say, I don't think any fresh cooking food, if it's nice food, smells bad.
No,
Stale food smells bad, and to me, when I smell my neighbors cooking mashed potato, I don't always like the smell, but I accept that they're cooking dinner. And in the summer, we'll smell it in our garden.
I see where you're coming from. I don't like a roast being cooked next door either. But the operating reality is that our cuisine with all the lovely masalas and so on, the fragrance does tend to carry. Now it appetizes some like me and it puts others off, and we just need to be mindful. So, by the way, I do the cooking in my home, so that saying you said about tumhare haath mein bada, my wife says that to me, so maybe that's
excellent.
The way to get kitchen. But the reality is that, and she also says, please be mindful, don't cook a nahari, to cook it all night, so it's, the whole corridor is going to smell of nahari spice.
Oh, but how good it will taste the next day. The gentleman right at the back there in the glasses, you had your hands up, and then we'll go to the lady in the front.
Thank you very much for the enlightening discussion. You spoke a little bit about the origins of food, and I was wondering whether you could go a bit deeper on that and shed some light on actually history of where some of this cuisine comes from. So, for example, I learned recently, I don't know if it's completely true or not, but that biryani emerged in the kitchens of the Mughal Empress Noor Jahan. And so, often in the UK, you were commenting on the food is associated with sort of migrant labor from South Asia coming here and setting up these curry kitchens, etc. But actually, some of these dishes, their origins carry great prestige back in South Asia. So if you could just say something about that. What are the foods you find most interesting from an historical angle?
Well, I think a lot has been made. You talk about Mughal kitchens, but a lot has been made of that North Indian food and its Mughal origins. But I think there are a lot of foods that are now in restaurants here from different regions, as South Indian foods are getting a good look in, Bengali food is getting a good look in. I think that there are different regional foods are coming more to the fore. And a lot of our foods, the other thing that is true apart from the foods of kings and queens is our street foods, our snacks. Our fast foods. Fast foods here are thought of as being kind of not healthy and sort of lowbrow, but a lot of our fast foods that were provided, like a lot of what we used to call Irani hotel. Irani hotels were catered, they cooked champ and they cooked cutlets and they cooked all for working class people who were up all hours, who could drop in. The food was inexpensive. They had a hot cup of mixed chai with all of this stuff. And then you had the roadside cafes for the truckwalas that catered with rotis and, and then a lot of what we wouldn't be ashamed to serve of in our homes for tea, our fast food snacks, whether they're samosas and pakoras or bhel puris or dahi vadas, all of this there's a whole lot of street food and fast food that you can pick up on the go that is also beginning to be available here and doesn't have that same connotation.
No, not as delicious.
Yes, exactly, and it's snack food, and it's not just. I don't know if that's the kind of thing you meant.
Hand that's just gone up there. Just wait for the microphone, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you if you know of a good quality, a high-end culinary school that exists in this country or anywhere in the world for Indian or Pakistani.
There are so many, I don't know because I haven't attended any, but I'm often tempted to, because you hear a lot of the Indian chefs who've written books and who are on television. A lot of them do cookery classes, so I guess if you Google them, and if you like any of their books, then go along to their classes. I know they exist in London, and I would like to go too.
Thank you. There's one hand that's just gone up there. Thank you.
When we were all here together in the late 60s, I don't remember you cooking at all.
No.
So when did you really start cooking seriously?
When I moved here in the 80s, when you have to. If you've got someone else to cook for you, why would you cook? But after, in the 80s, when I moved here, the only way to eat, if you can't afford to eat out, is to, and you want to eat well, is to eat at home. So I started to cook.
You started cooking quite late.
Yes.
Yes, I do remember that.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Hope for us all. Just final thought from you, sir.
So what are your views about this whole concept of the modern fusion Indian cuisine? In a sense, there's been a fusion taking place for at least 100 years, but the current narrative around that fusion is a dominant one. What are your thoughts?
I've eaten out some fusion food. It's not the food I cook. I used to be very pure about traditional food and about how, but I have eaten some really interesting things, and there's a lot of chefs. I mean, the thing that I don't like is that the chefs who are getting their Michelin stars, although their foods are really good, is because it's fusion with the West and the presentation is that which is recognized in the West. But there are some interesting people now who are doing fusion across the subcontinent. And that food I find very interesting. They're not necessarily fusing so-called generic Indian food with French or Italian, but they're fusing North with South, bringing also the people who moved to Kenya, who brought different influences from there, and those dishes are interesting. I found them tasty and different, and not what I make, but it's nice to go out and eat what you don't make.
Samin, thank you so much. For all those who feel that they're relatively accomplished chefs or cooks, I would recommend that you buy this for your friends. It's a fantastic gift, but also it's the kind of book that gives you confidence as a cook, and I really would recommend it for that reason. It's got some fantastic recipes in it, and I'm so pleased to have spoken to you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.